Welcome, folks. Today we will be covering RC Lesson 01, which is the single most common thing, the most fundamental thing that I have to teach every single student who crosses my path. Do not reread stuff within the passage on your initial read through. Again, do not reread stuff. If there's nothing else you get from this lesson, that's pretty much it, and that alone will change a lot about your performance in terms of time saving, getting questions right. So let's get right into it. So before getting into the actual lesson itself, like I've mentioned in previous videos, I am not new to the teaching of this, but I am quite new to creating content about it on the internet. So what I found was that doing logic games explanations, I knew that they would take a little bit longer than I would have liked, but I didn't expect them to go nearly as long as they all did. So because these have gotten so distressingly long, I've decided to, moving forward, include this very quick overview of what's to come right up front here so that you have some context for where we're going, and maybe you can even jet if it doesn't sound like what you need or it's all that you need. So let's go over the procedure itself that we will do. First thing, read a passage as you normally would, but do not reread anything. When you are tempted to reread, stop yourself and instead force yourself to answer the question, this thing, whatever it is, that I want to reread, can I figure out why the author put it here? If you can, that's good, that's great. If you can't, that's actually still okay. All you need to do is to look at the name of it, figure out, if it's a concept, a study, or some kind of story about something else. Just kind of give it a name, be able to identify it later so you can come back to it. All you need to do is know that it's there. You don't really need to know anything else about it. Ideally, you would know why it was there, but if you can't figure that out, or your brain is just not wired that way, it's not the end of the world. The whole point is rereading it isn't really going to help you. So don't reread it, just note its presence and move on. So after you get through the passage in this manner, before actually doing the questions, stop and do a fairly rapid paragraph by paragraph review. So it would sound something like, in paragraph 1, the author introduces the topic and brings up a problem with it that has divided opinions in the community. In paragraph 2, the author covers one side of the debate, blah, 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 and it continues with paragraph 3, 4, and possibly even 5 if you have a 5-paragraph one, which is relatively rare these days. But yeah, that's how the reading runs. And then after you've done that, you move into questions, and lo and behold, the questions will have you end up rereading parts of the passage anyways. So why do it 2 or 3 extra times initially when the question is going to make you do it anyway? It's just like deductions and logic game. The questions will tell you what's important anyway. So don't sit there trying to figure it out up front, wasting time and not answering questions. Go straight to the questions. They will tell you where to go. So the first thing you need to know about the RC methodology is that it's actually a parallel or an adaptation, if you will, of my LG methodology. So in the event that you have not seen my LG stuff, this is what it is. The whole point of skipping deductions in LG, which I recommend you do, I recommend you skip deductions entirely. The whole point of skipping deductions in LG and moving right to questions is that deductions are often hard, and you can waste many precious minutes trying and usually failing to squeeze them out. So most people who are trained traditionally in the LG methods are trained to look for deductions before even trying the first question. That doesn't work for most of us. I'm sure it does for some of you odd geniuses out there, but it just does not work for what appears to be the average human being sitting down for this. So yeah, it's often a waste of time. You can sit there and try, but you're gonna get nothing out of it. So instead, take those same minutes and head right into the questions. So instead of wasting 3 minutes on deductions that you're not going to get, take those same 3 minutes and just start the first question. At the very least, you'll just have 3 more minutes to do a question, and who wouldn't appreciate that kind of time, right? So what you'll find, though, is not only will you start answering questions and gaining points, it turns out that the first 3 questions or so tend to reveal all the deductions to you anyway. So without the context of the questions up front at the beginning, scratching for deductions is hard and you will probably fail. If you give up on deductions at that stage and then move directly to the questions, not only will you be rewarded from a score perspective for doing that, you'll actually end up getting those deductions as well along the way. So it's really quite a waste of time to try them up front before doing questions. So instead, forget doing deductions, don't spend time up front, and just move into questions. So oddly enough, a very similar phenomenon seems to happen in RC. Many people come to me complaining about the need to constantly reread denser parts of the passage that they didn't get the first time, and that kind of sets their timing off, and they get panicked, and all sorts of other bad things happen. This act of rereading is a lot like deductions. And let me hit you with something that I found to be true, despite how mean it sounds. The harsh truth is that with relatively rare exception, it appears that your understanding of whatever it is you're rereading doesn't actually improve with multiple readings. I've tried this through the form of assignments for students, and I've tried this live with them, and both of the things, especially the live readings, confirm this idea. You can reread something that you didn't get the first time, and you could read it 2 or 3 times, and you'll kind of construct some usually incorrect version of what you thought it was that you read. But even on the second or third reading, you're generally not going to have enough context to figure out what the actual thing is if you didn't get it the first time. You didn't magically get smarter. All you've done is you've passed your eyes over the same words 2 or 3 more extra times. That's all that you've done. You haven't actually changed the information that you have. So yeah, we can go, well actually I'll go over right now. So why does not rereading now, but rereading after you see a question or answer choice change things? Because the question or the answer choice usually gives you a different frame to look at. Either, like the question that we'll do in particular together today will be an analogy. And so that's kind of like the exam's way of saying, actually here's a metaphor for what I want you to go back and read. And here's 5 different potential examples of it. So you're getting different information, or at the very least a different lens to look at the information. So things have changed. Things have generally changed. Of course, there are some questions in reading comp that are open-ended, kind of like when you get an open-ended LG question. And so in that situation, you are a little bit on your own. But those questions are not quite as common in RC as they are elsewhere. So again, I want to reiterate the highlighted part. Unless you're kind of exceptional, and by definition, most of you are probably not, myself included, if you didn't get something the first time, you're probably not going to get it the second or third time. Really take this to heart. You might think you did, but chances are you don't really get it. So why spend time rereading and deceiving yourself that your understanding of it has changed, when in all likelihood it hasn't? And even if it has changed, I'm not discounting the possibility that maybe you just read too fast the first time, or by the time you did your second or third reading, you finally remembered some other terminology, something else you had learned that helps you understand. That's possible, right? But chances are, even if you have pursued this for several minutes, trying to understand the concept that you didn't understand the first time, that's what made you reread a certain section of the passage, you still probably don't have a very good idea of its logical significance because you were so honed in on the detail. Either way, I haven't seen it pay off for anybody. If you need to reread, don't. So it's kind of like my advice, it's exactly like my advice for deductions. Deductions? No, don't. Don't do them. Rereading? No, don't. Don't do it. That's it. So just to kind of parallel the structure of how I explained very briefly a little while ago how and why my LG method is designed the way it is. I teach students to stop and not attempt deductions before doing LG questions is the same reason why I teach students not to reread parts of a passage and instead focus on getting to the questions ASAP. There's a similar effect. Like deductions, rereading parts of a hard passage ahead of time doesn't make them any less hard. It's usually a waste of time. Instead, take that time and move to answering questions more rapidly. And just like deductions tend to get revealed by doing LG questions, the RC questions eventually direct you to reread the important parts of the passage. And not only that, with the added bonus of giving you a new context, new information, or at the very least, a slightly different lens to look at the same information in the passage. So why reread on your initial read-through? You're going to get the important information later anyways. And if you didn't get the important information the second time through, harsh reality, you weren't going to get it the first time anyway. Even less chance you would have gotten it the first time by rereading. So either way, from what I've seen, there is just no value in rereading the passage for like 99% of people. There's just no value in it. So don't do it. So to properly understand what it is that I'm trying to get you to do, we are going to start with reading for structure, not content. So we'll start with what you are not supposed to be doing on RC. What you are not supposed to be doing is reading for content. Content reading is what the author said. The names, the concepts, the years, basically the facts. Those don't really matter. Unfortunately, this is what school rewards us for doing and has done so for 20-ish years of your life. At least if you're the typical law school applicant, you will have been in school for 20x years, 20-odd years. The other unfortunate thing is that not only has school trained you to read this way of reading is terrible for RC. Because if you're focused on understanding the content, you're screwed, quite frankly. Unless you have an enormously high reading speed, you're screwed. The average person is not going to succeed. So now, we know what you're not supposed to do. What are you supposed to do? What you are supposed to do is read for structure. Reading for structure is to figure out how the author made their point, which is closely related to and revelatory as to why the author chose to say X thing at whatever part in the passage. So the how and why are kind of interlinked. They are very distinct from the what. They are very, very distinct from the what. School, of course, doesn't really care about this, at least the U.S. public school system, which is the one that I basically grew up and was raised in. And it never really teaches people to think this way. And I would be surprised if any other system out there really cared to do it either. That's just not what school does. It's not what school is for. And the unfortunate part of this is that this structural reading is the way the RC section, and in a broader sense, the legal profession, actually wants you to read. It's part of our secret superpower as a profession. If you think about it, even though the dominance of lawyer as an occupation is beginning to lose its grip on Congress, and again, as an American, that's just kind of my frame of reference. The single most common profession probably is still lawyer. As of the 60s, I think it had dropped to 60%, and by 2015, it dropped to 40%. But that's still telling you that 40% of Congress people are freaking lawyers. They're lawyers. They're some of us. How do these people, other than, nepotism or just being smart politically, those considerations aside, how is it that these people who are not experts in any other field get to make the rules for every single other field? What has possibly led to this state of affairs? How does the legalist, the lawyer, have all this power? It's because of stuff like this. We don't need to know exactly the same things and all the deep mastery and life's work of all these smarter engineers and scientists and these people to understand what the significance of their work is in society and how it should be ordered and what priority it should come into. Yes, it helps obviously to have literacy in these areas, and the more a decision maker knows specifically about the area, the better decisions ideally they'll make. But that's not really what it comes down to. You can have very smart people know all the hard things to know, but that's different than understanding the how and why of how things work with logic in general. So that's enough of an aside already. My goal is to really keep these, in keeping with the name of the channel being the minimalist, to keep these as short as possible. So I'd be happy to discuss this further with you individually, but also I have a different section of the channel planned for talking about this. So I'll leave it there for now, but reading for structure, basically, the point is, this is what both the profession and reading comp want you to do. So now that I've established that what you are supposed to do is structural reading, what actually do I mean by structural reading? I'll discuss this on two levels. I'll just give you a first hypothetical, same one I give to all my students, and then after that we will actually demonstrate what structural reading looks like on an actual RC passage. But to start with the hypothetical explanation that I give, I tell the story to all my students. I was a political science major in undergrad, and by the fourth year of my program, much like most other programs of study, I was pretty much enrolled in only very small seminar courses. And so these courses only have about 10-ish students in them, lots of reading, lots of discussion, that sort of thing, and lots of writing, of course, too. So typically, let's say in a week, we were assigned, roughly 60 pages of reading on Monday, and then a subgroup. So if my seminar had 10 people in it, it would be divided into two subgroups, 5 students each. My subgroup was assigned to meet again on Thursday with either the teaching assistant or the professor to discuss the reading that was assigned on Monday. So yeah, get assigned reading on Monday. You're supposed to have it all done by Thursday, and then you come ready to discuss it on Thursday with your subgroup. So let's say I show up on Thursday to discuss the reading. I get called on, and the professor asked me, "Hey James, did you do the reading?" And of course, because I was a bad student, this is a lie. I would say, yes, I did the reading, even though in reality I rarely had it done. But that's another story for another time. So let's say I actually did do the reading, and I get up and this is what I say. "Professor, I don't actually remember what the author said, but I do remember how they said it. The author starts the first 10 pages or so discussing the traditional theory of whatever. The next few pages after that discuss how this traditional theory fails to help us account for a recent phenomenon we've been observing in politics. And the next 40 pages after that describes a new theory that covers these holes that are left by the traditional theory that, of course, couldn't account for the new phenomenon that we are observing. And finally, the last 10 pages or so, the author argues that we should still keep the traditional theory around, even though it wasn't perfect, and we need to use both the old and the new theories together to have a full understanding of what's going on." So if I actually ever said this in a classroom scenario, I would fail, like miserably. Especially if this was the sort of class where you get a participation grade. I would get a 0 for participation in that day, and rightly so. But why is that the case? It would be because my instructor wanted me to learn the content. In poli-sci and basically anything academic, you do need to learn what things are, not just how people talk about them. The what, the concepts are important to for academic purposes. But shockingly, the type of reading that I just described that would have failed me in school actually works pretty well for this exam. So as promised, now that I have discussed what structural reading might look like in an academic setting or in a general hypothetical setting, let me talk to you about how structural reading for me looks in reading comp. First thing first, I don't actually read passages. I typically get through the quote-unquote reading phase in 45 to 60 seconds. That can hardly be called reading. I do have a relatively high actual reading speed, but even with a high reading speed, that's not really feasible. So hopefully you get the idea here that what I'm doing is not really reading in any typical sense. So this is my full RC procedure that I follow. I fully read the first sentence of the first paragraph, and then as my eyes pass over the words following that first sentence, I'm literally saying in my head, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, as a way to kind of force myself to ignore the things that my eyes are passing over. I do that until I find the beginning of the last sentence of the paragraph, and then I fully read the last sentence of the first paragraph. So again, basically what I'm doing is reading the first sentence of the paragraph fully, forcing myself to skip everything else. I'm looking only for the beginning of the last sentence of the paragraph. When I find that last sentence, I read that fully, and then I'm done with that paragraph. Well, not quite done. The next thing that I do after I read the last sentence is to compare the first and the last sentences, and I use that to predict two things. I predict what it is that I skipped in the first paragraph, which is surprisingly consistent in terms of the accuracy to which you can guess that based on just the first and the last sentence. And if possible, the next thing that I do is I predict what the next paragraph and maybe even the rest of the passage is going to bring up. And that also is surprisingly consistent, reading just those two sentences. I repeat the same process of reading first sentence, reading last sentence, predicting what I skipped, predicting what's to come. I repeat that for the rest of the paragraph, for the rest of the passages, rest of the paragraphs in the passage. And then I do that until I'm done. Just before I head into the questions, though, I do stop to review each paragraph only to describe what the author does, what the author accomplishes argumentatively in each paragraph. So it's kind of a rapid overview of the entire passage, paragraph by paragraph, and then I'm done. And after that, I move into the questions. That's the last thing that I do. So again, just to reiterate, the short sort of TLDR version of this is that for each paragraph, I only read the first sentence and the last sentence. I use those two sentences alone to guess what it is that I skipped when possible, or when I feel like it's even needed. Sometimes I don't even bother to do that. But for completeness sake, I use those two sentences to guess what it is I skipped and guess where it is the author is going to take the rest of the passage. That's it. And then finally, before actually moving into the questions, I just kind of do a lightning review of the whole thing, paragraph by paragraph, and my key focus is to understand what the author has accomplished, or at least set out to accomplish logically in each paragraph. And that's it. And then I move on to questions. Now, some of you at this point might not be too pleased with this demonstration of, well, I haven't really demonstrated, but this explanation of how it is that I read, because it is probably quite alien to how you are used to reading things. So here's some context for that. We'll start with the bad news. No student, not a single one, has successfully imitated my lazy non-reading of passages. Not once in almost 15 years. And I have basically been doing this for almost the whole time that I've been doing reading comp. This is one of the first things where I began to stray off script, as it were, from my initial teaching job at Kaplan. The things that Kaplan were teaching people to do, I did not agree with, and this is the way that I was doing it, and I began to impart this on my students. I started to see that it worked, but as an employee, you're not supposed to teach things that are not from a program that people have paid for, so that did get me into a little bit of trouble. But yeah, I do have to admit, nobody has successfully imitated this first and last sentence only business. The good news is that nobody has to do that, and I've had plenty of people who have found a lot of success not imitating it. So the real news, between the good and the bad, the real news is that my most successful students read passages like a normal human being. What a relief, right? They read passages like a normal human being until they hit something that they want to reread. And instead of rereading X detail, whatever it is, I have taught them to instead answer the question, why? For what logical purpose did the author include X detail here? It's actually possible, and in many cases, quite easy. To answer that why question, even if you don't know exactly what X detail actually is, you can still figure out based on, who the author attributes this detail to, or where it is in the passage. You can tell why they've included something even if you don't really know how to define whatever that something is. Believe me, it's possible. And if you don't think it's possible, or if you feel like you are working with a passage that you feel is an exception, do not hesitate to reach me via any of the other channels. I will be having a Twitter soon, even though that's not really my thing. I do have a presence on Reddit, and of course my email is in several places on the channel and in this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to help you see how this is possible. Because I admit that for a lot of people, it can be hard to see. So, the real value is, at the end of the day, the correct result is achieved. No matter what happens, no matter what the balance between skipping and reading is for you, the goal is to get you to spend less time on the reading phase and more time on answering questions. So very similar to LG. Less time on the setup, more time on questions, less time on reading, more time on questions. And the other thing is, something that I've mentioned previously already, you will end up rereading a lot of the passage during the questions anyway. So compulsively rereading stuff before we get to the questions is a total waste for the vast majority of readers. Really, again, I'm not discounting the possibility that maybe you read too fast the first time, it's a concept you actually understood, but you were just panicked or whatever, and so taking a breath and rereading it helped you. Fine. But, I mean, if that's a task that you're going to have to do anyway during the question, that was still a waste of time. You're still gonna do it again. There was really no point. For most of us, there was just like really no point. Okay. So to actually show you what it is this procedure yields for me in an actual passage, we will again be relying on the June 2007 exam. This time we'll be working with section 4 and the very first passage that covers questions 1 through 8. Again, in case you have missed my other videos in which I explained this briefly, the 07 exam is the one I've chosen to draw from because it's basically been available for free on the LSAC's website for a decade plus. I think it's not there in PDF format anymore, but it's still one of, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I do believe it is one of the ones they still offer all students free access to when you sign up for their sort of web format to train for the new web formatted exam. But back when this was pencil and paper, this was a PDF that they just gave everybody for free. So I could rely on, I've traditionally relied on this for as an exam that I know that everybody has access to regardless of what test material they may or may not have bought. So yeah, back to the good old June 07 exam. So another note is that when I teach reading comp to students, I never read passages ahead of time just because I hate every single passage that I come across in reading comp. Hopefully that will become apparent very soon. But yeah, I like reading. I hate reading comp. So take that as you will. But you're not getting quite the same experience that my one-on-one students are, because when I do it one-on-one, I'm doing passages live, so they literally get to hear me reason things out loud in a stream of consciousness. So they can actually hear me think, and they can hear what's going on in my brain to the best of my ability. Even though when I was typing out these slides for this video, I did do it live again, and it doesn't matter how many times I've done these passages. I hate them so much, and I read so little of them. I've taught this for over a decade, and I still don't have most of these passages memorized at all. So it is doing it fresh almost each and every time for me. So yeah, I did them live and did them fresh as I was doing the slides, but because going back and recording audio was something that I did separately, I am no longer kind of in the live environment, so you're not getting that stream of consciousness experience that my one-on-one students do. That being said, this is, I believe, at least the slides in my re-recordings here, are a faithful representation of the information, at least that I picked up, and that should give you some idea of how to manage this. So, paragraph 1. Oh yeah, I hate this kind of paragraph the most because they only have 2 enormous quasi-run-on sentences, and so that forces me to read the whole thing, and that also means that I do not get to really save time. I hate them a lot, like so much. But my personal grievances with this kind of paragraph aside, let's just do the first sentence. So the first sentence, I'll kind of let you do the reading for it, but basically, that can be boiled down to the author just bringing up the idea that there is a rift between poetry and fiction in U.S. academia or U.S. literary circles, whatever you want to call it. It's an American thing. There's a rift between poetry and fiction. That's all that I'm getting out of this overly long first sentence that technically I think I could have stopped reading after the semicolon, but it is what it is. And so moving to the second sentence. The other thing that they mention is that both poets and fiction writers, presumably American ones, tend to support the separation. So I don't. This is not really the best one to generate predictions, but the best I can do is to say that paragraph 2 and the rest of the passage are probably going to talk about why the separation happened or what the consequences are, because that last sentence doesn't really give us any particular hints. They're just saying that this rift not only does it exist, as the first sentence tells us, the second sentence seems to imply that the rift is kind of self-sustaining, at least by the people in the community where the rift happens. So there has to be a discussion, I think, coming up about how and why this came to be, and maybe we're going to talk about what the consequences of this division is. Paragraph 2. So the first sentence has some pretty interesting language here that I've decided to quote here. Why have specialized education and literary territoriality resulted? So to me, that those are just interesting words to use to describe the rift. But it's not really just describing the rift. It's adding these other extra $10 word categorizations to that rift. It's that not only is there a separation, that separation seems to have come from, or seems to at least be buttressed, supported by highly specialized education on, the poetry side and the fiction side, presumably. That's just a guess because I didn't read it. But also literary territoriality. So I guess each camp wants to stay in their own separate little worlds instead of mixing together. So what I can't help but notice that we hear that it's a widespread attitude, and so even though this isn't part of the first and last sentence, as my eyes are passing it over, I just see this because it's kind of how my RC brain has been trained to see passages. So I'm guessing that this is going to be, in some way related to answering the question that sentence 1 just asked. So again, sentence 1 asked, why does this, territoriality, just to kind of cut it short, territoriality, why was it a result of these two separated genres? And so apparently there's a widespread attitude that might help explain this. Again, I didn't really read, so I don't really know, but that's just my guess. Second sentence, my finding, risk charges of dilettantism. So if you don't know what a dilettante is, that of course hurts, but you can kind of get some context clues by earlier in that sentence, or the sentence before it. I don't even know because I'm not really looking at it right now. When they talk about dilettantism, they're really talking about lack of expertise. So generalism, being a generalist, jack of all trades versus a master, right? So that seems to be why, at least in America, that this divide between poetry and fiction is so durable. So at this point, I'm not really sure where they're going to go with this. But this is what I'm picking up. Territoriality. Charges of dilettantism. Those sound a bit judgy. They sound like the author is attributing very, very strong positions, or at least kind of pointed words, at the kinds of people who want to keep the separation. So the author probably doesn't like the separation, I guess. That's the only thing that I can think of at this point. So now here we move into paragraph 3. The first sentence. The prediction that I made. The author likes that the separation seems to be eroding, based on the first sentence. And as I have finished that first sentence and I'm doing my don't care thing through the rest of it, I can't help but notice the name Rita Dove as my eyes pass over all this artsy crap in the middle. Finally, I do get to the last sentence, which is someone, probably Rita Dove, is quoted as saying people in Europe basically are less uptight about all this than Americans. That's a pretty typical take for not only just LSAT passages in general, but academia in general. That's an argument that I'm sure you have heard ad nauseum if you have been to any foreign institution that's not specifically of a certain religious or political affiliation. This attitude is very widespread. Basically, somehow Europe is so much better at everything than America is, so much more open at least. That's a very common theme in academia. So my prediction based on this stuff is that reading column authors tend not to introduce people like Dove in this manner without talking more about them. Because the last sentence that we got about Dove seems to be setting up sort of a context for the rest of Dove's work, or at least the rest of the discussion about Dove's work. Paragraph 4 will very likely be more about Dove and a continued discussion of why the separation is done. Because so far, the author has used Dove so far as, well, I can't really tell for sure yet, but because I haven't done the reading, but if this quote is indeed from Dove, and it's saying, hey, it would be hilarious to Europeans that Americans keep this separation between poetry and fiction. To me, that's signs that the author is kind of speaking through Dove and using Dove as a sort of mask for making the same point that, hey, the separation is done. That's what I'm getting out of this. And lo and behold, the first sentence very much kind of holds that up. I do feel like the author right here is speaking through Dove to say the separation literally makes little sense. So there we go. I guess years of doing this kind of thing has paid off. I can predict what the next paragraph of a reading cop passage is going to say. But yeah, in the middle, I really don't even pick anything up here. Don't care, don't care, don't care, don't care. It's all way too dense. And finally, the last sentence. Dove bridges the gap apparently between the two genres. Not sure like why I need to care at all, but the author seems to see this as a cool thing, and I do know that the author probably well actually no let me get into it here down here. The prediction that I have is based on the fact that the last sentence begins with the preposition in short. That tells me that it's probably summing up a whole string of examples that proves the point made in that last sentence. So the chunk of paragraph 4 that I skipped is probably a whole string of examples of how Dove bridged the poetry and fiction divide, whatever that means. So I don't really know what it means to bridge the poetry and fiction divide, but I do know that if I want to find a description of how one person in particular did it, it would be read it of, and it would be paragraph 4 right here. And so again, before I do questions, I'm going to do a quick overall review of the passage paragraph by paragraph. Paragraph 1, the author introduces the quote-unquote problem. We'll call it an issue, but really, I mean, you can call it a problem. It doesn't really matter. The U.S. tends to divide poetry from fiction pretty strongly. Paragraph 2, the author raises the question as to why this divide exists and kind of suggests that it's because Americans have a durably bad attitude about it. The bad part, admittedly, is something that comes from my reading later in the passage, but at the very least, the author attributes it to an American attitude. Paragraph 3, the author is relieved that the separation seems to be weakening and mentions read it of probably as an example of said weakening. Paragraph 4. The author discusses exactly how, or at least in several different ways, Dove bridges that divide with her work. I guess this might suggest that closing the divide is a good thing, or at least worth looking into, or at least something that you shouldn't make fun of or discourage, at the very least. But again, those are just kind of author attitude things that I'm predictively putting out there because I've done so many of these passages that's just naturally where my mind goes. But really, just based on our minimal first and last sentence reading of each paragraph, this is, I think, a reasonable thing to come up with. So yeah, now to head right into the questions. Some questions based on that shallow reading, and we start right up with question 1, our usual old familiar friend, the main point question. These almost always lead off a reading comp passage, so there we go. Just answer choice. A is a solid no. Not only do I really not know at this point what or if, Read a Dove included lyric elements, this one entirely seems to miss the point about the author thinking that the poetry-fiction divide is stupid. I feel like any proper discussion of a main point of a question needs to incorporate that on some level. I feel like that's non-negotiable. B is also a hard no. It seems to be focused way too much on paragraph 4 kind of stuff. And like A completely ignores the author's position that the divide is stupid, that Dove is awesome for being someone who, kind of closes that gap. So B essentially has the same problem as A when it really comes down to it. Too focused on something very specific, and it misses an important element of what we saw in our overall shallow reading of it. C is a maybe. Rather than discuss it at length here, I will incorporate it as part of my discussion with E. So C is a maybe, though. D. D is another hard no. I don't actually know if she writes without relying on these traditional techniques, but it certainly isn't the main point. Identical problems A and B. It focuses on something pretty narrow, pretends like that's the main point, and also fails to include things that we have seen that was important to the author. They just totally don't take that into account. So yeah, I don't like D either. E is pretty much it. If you look at C, it sucks in comparison. So, if you recall paragraph 4, the author's last sentence didn't have a clear, come to the light moment where the author outright praises Dove for helping us all reach literary Jesus and unite poetry with fiction forever. There was no sort of giant cathartic moment. C is kind of pretending like we did have something like a come to the light moment. E does not, and it strikes a properly academic tone to match my paragraph summaries that we went over. So yeah, that's my problem with C. C is kind of acting as if there's some reconciliation point that the passage brings us to in terms of uniting these two things. That really wasn't the point. I think there's a strong implication that the author would be supportive of that kind of thing, but E accurately describes what we actually got. There was no, like I said, come to the light, come to Jesus moment where everybody kumbayas together and the two divided genres are one and we're all happy and forever in the Garden of Eden. That's not what happened. So having thus kind of dismissively conquered question one, again, based solely on the idea that our author didn't really talk to us about a sort of coming to Jesus moment where the two genres were united again and that which was broken was made whole. There was none of that. It was just this one person did kind of a mixture of the two and it seemed kind of cool. That's kind of where we ended up. And that landed us on answer choice E for the previous question. Having done that, let's move into question two. Question two is a little bit different. I just want to note that as soon as I saw the stem, because they were talking about an analogy, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe that means I needed to have a slightly greater sense of the details of what was going on. So that's a red flag to me that I might need to do some research in paragraph 4 if necessary. But, for starters, given that the author includes Dove as an example of someone across the divide between poetry and fiction, I can guess that the analogy is going to be about, successfully crossing the divide between two different things. I mean, how hard could it really be ultimately in the end, right? So, even though I feel like I may need to do some paragraph 4 rereading, I'm not actually going to do it until the answer choices clearly indicate that I need to. And then when I get to answer choice A, it to me, upon reading A, that clearly indicates that I need to peek at the passage, probably paragraph 4, to get a better idea of exactly how the author describes Dove's successful bridging of the gap. Because all I know from my base reading, my shallow reading, is that Dove somehow did divide, or bridge the gap, but I don't know how she did it. And these answer choices all seem to hinge on how she actually did it. So, looking back at paragraph 4, it looks like Dove's poetry is certainly poetry, but it also acts like narrative fiction. That's from the beginning of paragraph 4, like just after the first sentence. Dove's poetry certainly is poetry, but it also has a lot of narrative fiction elements in terms of, the thing that it says about making the reader keep track of, the progression of narrative facts or whatever that is. And then the rest of the paragraph, moving onwards, when the author talks about Dove's fiction. Dove's fiction is certainly like other normal fiction, but it also acts pretty poetic in a lot of ways, specifically in rhythm and whatever elliptical expression is supposed to be. So yeah. So that's what I'm getting. So overall, it looks like, if I tried to make it more generic, Dove's ability to successfully bridge the gap is described by the author as basically saying Dove's work in Category 1 did a lot of Category 2 things, and likewise, Dove's work in Category 2 managed to do a lot of Category 1 things. So again, Dove's poetic work seems to do a lot of fiction stuff, and on the flip side, Dove's fiction work was successful at doing a lot of poetic stuff. So that's the general breakdown. Her Category 1 work was able to do Category 2 things, and vice versa. Her Category 2 work was able to do a lot of Category 1 things. So a final note before I take that into the answer choices. How did I know to look at paragraph 4 instead of paragraph 3? A lot of it admittedly is experience. I just know that paragraph 3 is a bit tight in terms of not just words and that kind of stuff, just in terms of the conceptual space, the real estate that it takes. It's a bit small to have the author go into great detail about how specifically Dove bridged the gap. That was very much more so in both volume and wording and positioning, probably going to be a paragraph 4 thing. Paragraph 4 sentence, just like we said, indicates that the rest of that paragraph probably contained a list of things Dove did specifically. And again, we said that exact same thing in our overall paragraph review and our review of paragraph 4. So again, by focusing on just the first and last sentences, I am able to keep track of these things. And yeah, paragraph 4's last sentence was a pretty clear indication that paragraph 4 was going to be fairly rich with detail. It's going to have a string of examples that demonstrate, at least in our author's view, demonstrate whatever it is the author wanted Dove's work to demonstrate. So yeah, that's why I know to look at paragraph 4 instead of paragraph 3. So again, now that we are armed with our rereading of paragraph 4, which told us, again, the whole special thing about Dove is that her Category 1 work did a lot of Category 2 things, and vice versa, her Category 2 work did a lot of Category 1 things. So I'm gonna look at it with that framework. A is probably not it. Dove, again, was not credited with making something brand new so much as doing the Category 1-2 thing that we talked about. She made her Category 1 work act like Category 2 work, while still remaining Category 1 work. so that her poetry was poetry, but it acted like fiction. Her fiction was fiction still, but it still acted like poetry somehow. So it's not that they were totally obliterated. It was just they were doing things from the other category. B's a solid no. Just no. Dove didn't succeed in one category because she had theoretical mastery of the other category. That was never mentioned. So no, that's dumb. C is also a no. Like team up, like teaming up. No. She didn't use poetry to team up with fiction to accomplish yet a third thing. It's dumb. Don't do it. D's a pretty solid yes for me at this point. Dove defied the convention, as the answer choice indicates in the analogy. She defied the convention of keeping Category 1 separate from Category 2, and her works combined elements of both categories at once. So just like the person being mentioned here in answer choice D's analogy, this person defied convention and mixed two genres of music. And that's what Dove did. She defied the convention of keeping the separation and mixed the two genres of poetry and fiction. It's almost literally word for word the same thing. And finally, we'll just check E for completion's sake, even though D is pretty much spot on. E's a nope. It's a solid no. This has nothing to do with mixing the categories. Just about some weirdo desecrating already existing works, adding his solo to other stuff. And to be fair, maybe he wasn't desecrating. Maybe he was improving. But that doesn't matter. None of it. That this is not what Dove was described as doing. She wasn't just adding like a line of poetry to somebody else's poetry already. Yeah, that's not it. So for purposes of brevity and efficiency, I'm actually not going to demonstrate any more questions in this presentation. So hopefully you can get the point from the things that I'm reviewing here. So just to review where we are. Question 1 showed us an example of where a sort of lazy, or at least a very rapid reading focused on structure. That kept our eye on the prize, not losing sight of the key idea that the poetry-fiction separation is dumb. Was literally all you needed to get this one right, and a lazy reading makes that abundantly clear, that the author thinks that. Question 2 was slightly better or more explanatory. It showed us an example of not so much a question like question 1 where we didn't really need to go back and reread anything, but question 2 did in fact show us that with a rapid, shallow reading that I advocate, you can nonetheless have a decent enough mental map of the passage to go back to the place where the question directs you to. And here, it happened to be paragraph 4. So, again, question 2 showed us how we could go back and reread the right spots when and as a question demands it. So, you do not have to predict the need to reread based on the question stem alone. I was kind of up in the air. I was thinking that maybe I did, but I didn't actually do it until the answer choices made it obvious to me that I was missing something. So you don't have to predict the need to reread based on the stem alone. And as I did, you just move to the answer choices, and the first answer choice might let you know when it is that you need to reread. As for where to reread, it all goes back to the thing that I've been mentioning in passing, having a good mental map of the passage from your initial reading. That's what's important. And you build that map by reading for structure and also by doing that paragraph by paragraph review of the passage before you hit the questions. That paragraph by paragraph review is something that I recommend doing for most people starting out, but eventually, if this becomes second nature to you, again, you don't have to do the lazy reading in the 45 to 60 seconds that I do it. But even with the more heightened reading pace, since you're reading the passage normally, there's a chance that at a certain point you're not really going to need to give yourself that paragraph by paragraph review at the end. You might still find it helpful, you might not. That's still like almost a minute of work probably for most purposes. So minutes are valuable. Minutes are valuable. Every single one counts. So you may be able to get away with not doing that. But either way, the only way you can get away with not doing that final pre-question review of the passage is if you have managed to build a good mental map of the passage anyway, based on your standard once through reading. So yeah, it's all about mapping out the passage in the head and knowing this is probably where I need to go to figure out X, and this is probably where I need to go to figure out Y. That sort of thing is what you're trying to develop with your reading skills here. But what I want to emphasize here, that both questions 1 and 2 probably demonstrated that a lot of the legwork actually comes in the form of assessing answer choices. So what was obvious to me from a language standpoint might not be so obvious to you. That's probably one of the most obvious things that anyone can say about this exam. The language that I find unconfusing may make you quite flabbergasted sometimes. And this is why one-on-one tutors can still make a living. A lot of the gains that you make in reading comp only come from adjusting your mental language to fit that of the exam. And most people don't really have the wherewithal to do it on their own very well. It's either a matter of time or effort or just raw ability. For me, again, there were various factors that favored my preparation for the exam, but also I just happened to naturally think already quasi-sociopathically like the exam does. So it wasn't that big of an adjustment for me to see what it is this exam was autistically trying to tell us. And I was able to kind of plug into it. But that's not something that most of us can do, and rightly so, because socialization kind of ensures that most of the time we don't think like this. We don't think like this. We don't act like this. We don't read like this. This is not what we do. So that's kind of my justification for not doing more questions, really. So while I'm still considering doing kind of a question-specific or answer-choice-specific demonstration video for reading comp, I'm really not going to do any more questions on this particular video. Oh, even though there are, questions 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 still remaining from this passage, plenty for us to do. Not only am I going to run out of time on the video, it's also just not going to help. Honestly, the result would look pretty much like almost every other LSAT resource out there. It would just basically be like 7Sage or LSAT Max or anybody else out there, where I just list the answer choices and why I eliminated or picked them. That doesn't really do anything for you. That really doesn't do anything for you. And that's why not everybody who takes a prep course gets a 180. I mean, that's just not what helps you. And so, again, that sort of answer choice breakdown really isn't anything special. The only thing that I really want to demonstrate is that a very lightweight, bare bones reading on your first read through of the passage is more than enough to start answering questions correctly. I want you to avoid that trap. That's why I made this technique, and that's why I teach it the way I do, because so many people trap themselves. You have trapped yourself if you feel like you need to understand the passage before you move on to the questions. You really do not. You do not need to, well, let me put it another way. You do not need to understand the content. What you have convinced yourself, if you're seeing this, is probably that you need to understand the content of the passage to understand its logic. And I'm here to tell you that you do not. You can have the most absolutely minimalistic understanding of the content and still have a very strong grasp of how the logic of it all works. And the logic of it is what's going to give you many, many, many more points on this section than anything else. That's where the points come from. And so finally, I just want to mention, if you can't seem to get this methodology to work for you, if you're not rereading things and you're kind of being disciplined about reading for structure, but you can't get it to work for you, or you just think I'm full of crap, which of course is your right. This is, at least I'm recording this in America, that is your right here. Feel free to very directly challenge me in the comments or via email. I do have a Reddit presence, and I am going to be starting some other social media channels. I'm not sure what they are, but yeah. I'd be glad to meet any challenge, because that's honestly how most people, my students who are even paying me $100 an hour, react to this, with some kind of hostility. And I get it. Reading is something that we've done all of our lives. We've done it well, and it's frustrating that all of a sudden it's not really working here, because you know how to read. Almost everybody does. Sure, some of us enjoy it less than others. Some of us have found it more academically difficult than others. But this is reading like a 500-word thing. That's, passages are 500 to 600 words long. That's half a page single space. That's not a lot. That's not a lot, folks. And so there's a discrepancy between how easy and small this stuff seems to be versus how hard it is to get questions right. And not only that, here I am telling you that you don't actually even need to read. So, of course your reaction is going to be, what? WTF? What are you saying, dude? Like, that's of course the reaction. So I'm used to it. Challenge me directly. Bring me whatever passage it is that you think disproves that my methodology works, and I will very, very sincerely be happy to help you get through it, and see and show you how this thing works. I'm actually considering adding a format of live streams eventually when I get something of an audience in this sort. And I don't actually even need much of an audience. Just if I get any sort of comments, I'll do it for one person if I have to. Sort of like in the Reddit AMA style, where just bring me any question you have and I'll just do it live. And you guys and anybody who is willing to see will get to see it. And of course, the VOD will be up later. The recording will be up later for posterity to witness as well. So yeah, that might be a good place for it in the future. But for now, the only ways to reach me are through Reddit, through the emails that are provided here, and any other social media that I put up eventually. Yeah, that's the only way to get a hold of me. But please do not hesitate to reach out if you feel like you've run into something that directly contradicts this methodology, that makes it impossible to do. I'm not going to pretend like this methodology is like the be-all, end-all. Very, very few things work for absolutely everybody, but I think this is the closest I've come as an instructor, coming up with something that works pretty universally. So yeah. And as usual, that brings us to the end of the video where I pander to you and the algorithm alike. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, that helps the channel. Leave a comment, that also helps, but not so much for like algorithm purposes, but that just helps me. Leave feedback for me. Let me know what works and what didn't for you, and I will take that into consideration as I continue to build the channel here. The other place to get a hold of me is this email address that I have up here, shycity180@gmail.com. If you have any further questions, or like I just said on the previous slide, if you've got a challenge, if you think I'm wrong, and I'd be glad to talk to you about it. Maybe I am. Who knows, right? But really, 99% of the time, I'm not actually wrong. I just need to be able to explain one-on-one to you how the methodology works. So, but I would be happy to respond to any challenges that you have personally, because that's what I do. I help people overcome challenges. Yeah, and also another reminder, if you do need practice material, I do recommend using the LSAC officially released materials. Again, this is not because I am knocking any of the other test prep places, but those places are not giving you just the exams, which they've paid a hefty sum to the LSAC for. They also have to pay whoever made the program and whatnot, so you're getting a lot of extra stuff within not necessarily the same value out of it. And again, I'm not knocking any of the other test prep solutions. I'm just simply not familiar with any particular one to endorse it. So I only endorse that which I do know, which is the standard exams. You get no more, no less, and you have plenty of material there at a decent price. See you next time.